Picture this for a second. 9 experienced hikers, all trained for the harshest conditions you can imagine, found dead on a mountain the locals called Mountain of the Dead. But here's the kicker. Their tent was sliced open from the inside, like they were desperate to escape something terrifying. Some of them were barely clothed, running barefoot into negative 30-degree weather, which is basically a death sentence. Now, what could possibly scare seasoned adventurers so badly that freezing to death seemed like the better option? That's the Dyatlov incident, folks, and it's one of the most chilling discoveries in true crime history. What's wild is that this isn't just some campfire story. This is a real cold case that's haunted investigators, documentary filmmakers, and conspiracy theory enthusiasts for over 60 years. We're talking about February 1959, deep in the Soviet Union's Ural Mountains, where a group of young, skilled hikers embarked on what should have been a challenging but achievable expedition. These weren't amateurs, mind you. They were aiming for a Grade 3 certification, the highest honor in Soviet hiking. But something went horribly, inexplicably wrong on that frozen mountainside. The unexplained phenomena surrounding this hiking tragedy goes way beyond what you'd expect from a simple accident. We're talking about evidence of radiation on their clothes, massive internal injuries comparable to a car crash with 0 external bruises, and missing body parts that make your skin crawl. One victim was found without her tongue and eyes. Another had his eyeballs gone. The official Soviet investigation? They blamed it on an unknown compelling force, and then locked the files away for decades. Yeah, that's not suspicious at all, right? Here's what really gets me. The Russian government has changed their story multiple times over the years, which only fuels the fire of speculation and makes you wonder what exactly they're hiding. Was it a secret military test gone wrong? Some kind of paranormal encounter? A natural disaster that the Soviets didn't want to admit could happen? The conspiracy theories range from plausible to downright bizarre, but the fact remains, 9 people died under circumstances so strange that even modern science struggles to explain it all. If you've ever been fascinated by unsolved mystery cases or historical events that just don't add up, buckle up. This survival story, or rather, the tragic lack of survival, is about to take you down a rabbit hole of Soviet history, strange phenomena, and questions that still don't have clear answers. The Dyatlov Pass incident, named after the group's leader Igor Dyatlov, isn't just about missing persons who were eventually found dead. It's about the secrets buried in the snow, the evidence that doesn't fit any normal explanation, and the wall of silence that the Soviet government built around this tragedy. What makes this case even more haunting is that we have their diaries, their photographs, and detailed autopsy reports. Yet somehow, all this evidence only deepens the mystery instead of solving it. It's like having all the puzzle pieces, but they don't quite fit together the way they should. And trust me, once you dive into the details of what happened on that mountain, you'll understand why this remains one of the most disturbing enigmas of the 20th century. So let's dig into what really went down during that ill-fated expedition, and why, after all these years, the truth still feels just out of reach. Let me take you back to late January 1959 when this whole thing kicked off. The Soviet Union was at its peak. Cold War tensions were sky high, and the country was trying to prove its strength in every possible way, including through athletic and outdoor achievements. That's where our group comes in. 10 students and recent graduates from the Ural Polytechnic Institute decided to tackle a grueling 300-kilometer trek through the northern Ural Mountains. Their goal? To earn that prestigious Grade 3 certification I mentioned earlier. This wasn't some casual weekend camping trip. This was serious business. The leader was a 23-year-old engineering student named Igor Dyatlov, and by all accounts he was meticulous, experienced, and cautious. Exactly the kind of person you'd want leading an expedition into one of the harshest environments on Earth. With him were 8 others. Zinaida Kolmogorova, who friends described as the heart of the group. Rustem Slobodin, a strong engineer. 2 guys both named Yuri, Doroshenko and Krivonishenko, who were known for their good humor. Nikolai Thibault Brignol, the Joker. Alexander Kolovatov, who studied nuclear physics. And yeah, that detail becomes weirdly relevant later. And Lyudmila Dubinina, the youngest at just 20 years old. Then there was Semyon Zolotaryov, who went by Alexander, At 38, he was the oldest and most mysterious member of the group. Here's what's interesting. He was a World War II veteran who joined the expedition at the last minute. Nobody really knew much about his background, and his presence has always added an extra layer of intrigue to this whole mystery. Some conspiracy theories suggest he might have been a Soviet agent, though there's no solid evidence for that. Still, it makes you think, doesn't it? Now here's the twist that probably saved one life. There was actually a 10th member, Yuri Yudin. A few days into the journey, he developed severe sciatic nerve pain that made it impossible to continue. He said goodbye to his friends and turned back, having no idea it would be the last time he'd see them alive. What seemed like terrible luck at the time turned out to be the only reason he survived. Yudin spent the rest of his life haunted by survivor's guilt and questions about what really happened to his friends on that mountain. The diaries and photographs recovered from the scene paint a picture of a happy, optimistic group in those first days. They were singing songs, joking around, and the weather was manageable. One entry from January 30th mentions meeting some indigenous Mansi people and learning what they called the mountain the group was about to climb. Kolat Shakal. In the Mansi language, that translates to Mountain of the Dead. Yeah, I know. Talk about an ominous sign that nobody took seriously enough. But here's where things start getting weird. On February 1st, the weather took a nasty turn. A blizzard with brutal winds knocked them off their planned route. Any experienced hiker knows that when conditions deteriorate like that, you either find shelter or you turn back. But Igor Dyatlov made a strange and ultimately fatal decision. He decided to set up camp right there on the exposed mountainside, with zero natural protection from the elements. Why would such an experienced leader make that call? Was he exhausted? Overconfident? Or, and this is what keeps me up at night, was he already running from something? That last diary entry was written on February 1st. After that, nothing but silence. And what happened next would become one of the most analyzed, debated, and terrifying mysteries in modern history. So here's where this survival story turns into a nightmare. The group was supposed to return by February 12th, but that date came and went with no word from them. At first, nobody was too worried. Delays happen on tough expeditions, right? But as the days dragged on, the families grew frantic and started pressuring Soviet authorities to launch a search. Finally, on February 20th, a massive search operation got underway. Volunteers, students, police, and even the military joined the effort to find these missing persons. 6 days later, on February 26th, a pilot spotted something odd from the air: a tent, partially buried in snow, sitting alone on the mountainside. The rescue team rushed to the location, but what they found wasn't survivors. It was a scene of frozen chaos that defied all logic. The tent was empty, and here's the part that still gives me chills. The canvas had been cut and torn from the inside. Whoever was in that tent had been so desperate to get out that they didn't even use the entrance. They literally slashed their way through their only shelter in sub-zero temperatures. But wait, it gets worse. Inside the tent, the rescuers found everything the hikers owned: backpacks, food, maps, and most shockingly, their boots and winter coats. Think about that for a second. These were experienced mountaineers who knew that in negative 30-degree weather, going outside without proper gear is suicide. Yet they fled into the darkness anyway, leaving behind the very things that could have kept them alive. What kind of terror could make trained hikers choose certain death over staying in their tent? Outside, the search team found a trail of footprints heading down the slope toward a forest about 1.5 miles away. The tracks showed 8 or 9 people, some wearing only socks, others completely barefoot. In that kind of cold, your feet would start freezing within minutes. This wasn't a calculated decision. This was pure panic. But panic from what? That's the question that's haunted this cold case for decades. The next day brought the first bodies and the first answers, though honestly, they just raised more questions. Under a large cedar tree, rescuers found the remains of a small fire and 2 bodies: Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko. Both were barefoot and wearing only their underwear. Their hands were scraped raw, and tree branches above them were broken up to about 15 feet high, suggesting they'd tried to climb up, maybe to look back toward camp or to escape something on the ground. Cause of death: hypothermia. Tragic, but at least it made sense. A few hundred yards away, they found 3 more bodies: Igor Dyatlov, Zinaida Kolmogorova, and Rustam Slobodin. Their positions suggested they'd been trying to crawl back toward the tent. They'd also died of hypothermia. But here's a detail that didn't quite fit. Slobodin had a small skull fracture. It wasn't fatal, but it added another piece to this increasingly bizarre puzzle. How'd he get that injury? Up to this point, despite how strange everything was, you could maybe chalk it up to some kind of panic-induced disaster. Maybe they heard an avalanche coming and ran. Maybe someone had a psychological break. But then came the discovery that changed everything and turned this hiking tragedy into one of history's most unexplained phenomena. 2 months later, in May, after the snow started melting, searchers found the remaining 4 hikers at the bottom of a ravine, buried under 13 feet of snow. And what they found with those bodies turned this mystery from strange to absolutely terrifying. These weren't just hypothermia victims. These 4 had died from massive internal trauma that would rewrite everything we thought we knew about what happened on that mountain. The 4 bodies found in the ravine, Lyudmila Dubinina, Semyon Zolotaryov, Alexander Kolovatov, and Nikolai Thibault Brignol, told a completely different story than the first 5. These weren't simple hypothermia deaths. These people had suffered catastrophic injuries that made absolutely no sense given the circumstances. Nikolai had a devastating skull fracture. Lyudmila and Semyon had multiple broken ribs, crushed with such force that the medical examiner compared it to being hit by a car. But here's what really messes with your head. There were no corresponding external bruises. 0. It was as if they'd been crushed by some invisible force. And then there's the part that truly belongs in a horror documentary. Lyudmila Dubinina's body was missing her tongue, eyes, part of her lips, and facial tissue. Semyon Zolotaryov was also missing his eyeballs. Now, the official explanation was that this happened after death, caused by decomposition in running water and scavenging animals. Okay, that's plausible from a scientific standpoint. But when you're already dealing with a mystery this deep, it's the kind of detail that makes conspiracy theories explode. And wait, there's more. Some of their clothing, specifically Dubinina's sweater, showed detectable levels of radioactive contamination. Let's recap what we've got here. 9 dead, a tent sliced open from the inside, a panicked flight into the snow, deaths from both freezing and massive crushing injuries, missing body parts, traces of radiation. When the Soviet government was faced with this absolutely baffling puzzle, their response was quick, secretive, and deeply unsatisfying. The criminal investigation was opened in late February 1959, led by a prosecutor named Lev Ivanov. The medical examiner, Boris Vozrojdeny, stated clearly that the fatal injuries to Dubinina and Zolotaryov couldn't have been caused by another human being. The force required was simply too great. Meanwhile, witnesses started coming forward with their own chilling discoveries. Another group of hikers, about 30 miles away, reported seeing strange orange glowing spheres in the sky in the direction of the mountain that same night. Similar reports came from weather stations and military posts in the area. Ivanov took this seriously enough to order radiation testing, which confirmed the low-level contamination on some clothing items. This is where things should have gotten really interesting, right? A serious investigation into what those lights were, what caused the injuries, why there was radiation present. But then suddenly, everything stopped. In May 1959, less than 3 months after the investigation began, Ivanov received orders from his superiors to shut it down. The official conclusion was absurdly vague. The cause of death was an unknown compelling force that the hikers were unable to overcome. Nobody was blamed. No further investigation was warranted. Case closed. The files were classified as secret, and the area was forbidden to hikers for the next 3 years. An unknown compelling force. What the hell does that even mean? It's a non-answer, a deliberate cover-up. For decades, the Soviet government's silence was deafening. It wasn't until the 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, that Lev Ivanov himself finally broke his silence. In an interview, he admitted he'd been pressured by high-ranking officials to abandon the investigation and dismiss the flying spheres theory. He said he believed the deaths were directly connected to those objects and regretted following orders. His exact words haunt this case. At the time, I suspected, And now I'm almost certain that those glowing spheres had a direct connection to the group's death. That admission confirmed what many had suspected all along. The Russian government knew more than they were saying. The official conclusion wasn't incompetence, it was a smokescreen. But why? What were they trying to hide? That vacuum of information became the perfect breeding ground for dozens of theories, ranging from the plausible to the downright paranormal. With the official story falling apart, a whole universe of alternative theories emerged, and honestly, some of them are pretty compelling. Let's break down the main ones, because understanding these theories is key to figuring out what might have really happened on that deadly mountain. First up, secret military experiments. This is probably the most convincing theory out there, and here's why. The 1950s were peak Cold War era, and the Ural Mountains were a perfect location for testing classified weapons. What if Dyatlov's group just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time? Supporters of this theory point to those orange glowing spheres as potential missiles or tests of a thermobaric weapon, basically a fuel-air bomb that creates a devastating pressure wave. That kind of weapon would perfectly explain the internal injuries without external damage. Think about it. A sudden blast wave could crush ribs and fracture skulls without leaving a mark on the skin. The radiation fits this theory too. It could have been residue from a missile component. Now, to be fair, the contamination levels were pretty low, and one of the hikers, Yuri Krivonishenko, had worked at the Mayak nuclear complex, which could explain it differently. But still, the presence of any radiation at all feeds into the military suspicion. In this scenario, a blinding light followed by a shockwave would have been absolutely terrifying, explaining why they cut through their tent to escape. The Soviet government, realizing civilians died in a secret test, would have had every reason to cover it all up. The story fits perfectly with how the authorities behaved. Then there's the paranormal angle, and look, I know how this sounds, but hear me out. The UFO theory is fed directly by those glowing sphere reports and Ivanov's confession. If they weren't missiles, what were they? For some people, the answer is obvious. Extraterrestrial craft. An encounter with them could have caused the panic and the injuries through some kind of energy weapon we don't understand. The facial mutilations on Dubinina are often cited as evidence of sample collection. It's straight out of a science fiction documentary. But for a case this bizarre, some folks argue it's the only explanation that actually covers all the bases. There's also the creature theory, specifically the Russian Yeti. The Mansi people have legends about large, hairy creatures living in the region. A Discovery Channel documentary back in 2014 popularized this idea, suggesting a violent encounter with a terrifying creature could explain the panicked flight and the crushed bones. The problem? No animal tracks or large creature footprints were found at the scene, only those belonging to the hikers themselves. Plus, this theory doesn't explain the radiation or the lights in the sky. It's dramatic, sure, but it doesn't hold up under scrutiny. Now let's talk about natural phenomena. One of the most interesting theories is infrasound, proposed by author Donnie Eichar. He suggests a rare weather condition called a Kármán vortex might have occurred. When wind passes an obstacle in just the right way, it can create extremely low-frequency sound, infrasound. You can't hear it, but it can cause intense panic, terror, and breathing difficulties. This would explain the irrational flight from the tent. Once they got away from the infrasound zone, they would have regained their senses, but by then it was too late. They were already dying in the cold. This theory explains the panic beautifully, but it fails to account for the traumatic injuries. And then there's the avalanche theory. For decades, this was the most common natural explanation, but also the most contested. The 1959 investigators dismissed it because there were no obvious signs, and the slope was considered too gentle. If a massive avalanche had hit, it would have swept everything away. But the avalanche theory would come roaring back years later in a much more sophisticated form, and it's actually pretty fascinating. Modern scientists revisited this using computer modeling and proposed something called a delayed slab avalanche. We're not talking about a huge avalanche. We're talking about a relatively small slab of compacted snow that built up pressure over hours before finally releasing in the middle of the night. In 2019, the Russian prosecutor's office reopened the case, trying once and for all to end the speculation. Their conclusion in 2020? Avalanche. followed by hypothermia. But how could that be, given all the problems with that theory? Well, in 2021, two Swiss scientists, Johann Gaume and Alexander Puzrin, published a study that used computer modeling, including snow animation technology from the movie Frozen, which is wild, to propose a new hypothesis that actually makes sense. Here's their theory. To protect themselves from wind, the group cut into the snow to set up their tent, which destabilized a snow layer above them. During the night, strong winds deposited more snow onto this unstable slab. It took hours, but eventually the tension reached a critical point. In the middle of the night, a slab of snow about 16 feet wide broke loose and slammed into the tent. It wasn't a massive avalanche. It was a heavy, compact sheet of snow. The model showed that a hard snow block sliding over the skis that were underneath the tent floor could inflict exactly the kind of chest and skull injuries found on Thibaut Brignol, Dubinina, and Zolotaryov without external damage. A sudden impact in the darkness would have been terrifying. With several members severely injured, they would have cut through the tent to escape and help their companions. From there, the tragedy unfolded. The fight against hypothermia, the failed attempt to return, and death in the cold. For many in the scientific community, this theory finally solved the Dyatlov incident. Case closed, right? Well, not quite. The avalanche theory, as elegant as it is, leaves some of the strangest questions unanswered. It doesn't explain those orange glowing spheres that multiple witnesses reported. Scientists say it was a coincidence, maybe an unrelated missile launch, but that's one hell of a coincidence. The theory also doesn't directly address the radioactive contamination. And what about the missing tongue and eyes? The decomposition explanation is plausible, but it continues to fuel speculation among true crime enthusiasts and conspiracy theory believers. For skeptics, this new avalanche explanation is just another official story. More sophisticated than the last one, sure, but still a way to sweep the disturbing details under the rug. Science can explain how they died, but it might never explain the veil of secrecy the Soviet government threw over this tragedy from day one. And that's what keeps this mystery alive. When you've got a government actively hiding information, classifying files, and pressuring investigators to drop certain leads, it's natural to assume there's something more to the story. So here we are, over 60 years later, and the Dyatlov Pass incident remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries of the 20th century. Was it truly just a tragic avalanche that the Soviets mishandled and then covered up out of embarrassment? Or was there something else on that mountain? A military test, perhaps, or something we still can't fully explain. The historical events are documented, the evidence is preserved, but the truth? That's still buried somewhere in the snow of the Ural Mountains. What's clear is this: 9 young people went on an expedition full of hope and never came home. Their story has become legend, a chilling discovery that reminds us how much we still don't understand about the world, and about what governments choose to hide from us. The Soviet history books might say one thing, but the evidence tells a more complicated, more disturbing tale. And as long as questions remain unanswered, people will keep searching for the truth about what really happened on the Mountain of the Dead. The Dyatlov incident isn't just a cold case. It's a reminder that some mysteries refuse to stay buried, no matter how hard anyone tries to cover them up.